Hi, welcome to another lecture on VPC connector. In my previous lecture on VPC connector, I had told you how you can use your VPC connector to connect a cloud function to a instance in a VPC. This is going to be a little different. So in this lecture, I'm going to explain to you how you can use your VPC connector to connect your cloud function to an SQL, a cloud SQL, which is another managed GCP service. So as you know, a serverless VPC gives the cloud function the capacity to connect to a particular VPC network. This I had already covered in my previous lecture, and I'm going to give a link to that particular video in the description below. So in this particular lecture, I'm going to explain to you how you can use your VPC connector to connect your Lambda to an SQL, a cloud SQL. So let's imagine you have a project which contains a VPC called myFest VPC, and you have a particular region in which you want to create your cloud function. Let's imagine it's US East 1. So what you do next is you create a cloud SQL, and you connect that cloud SQL to myFest VPC using a private IP. I'll mention to you how that is done. So what that does is it creates a link between your myFest VPC and the cloud SQL using the private IP. The second thing you do is you create your cloud function and you connect it to a SQL. You connect it to the serverless VPC connector, and both of them have to reside within the same region, as I had mentioned to you in the previous video. So what this does is this architecture now makes it possible for the cloud function to actually access the cloud SQL using the private IP of the cloud SQL. Let's look at an example of how this is done. And of course, if you want to connect to a public IP, you can directly do it. You don't need to even access the VPC. So let's see a demo on how this is done. So I have created an SQL instance, and this SQL instance has a private IP, and it is associated with myFest VPC. That is basically the VPC in this particular project. If you want to see how that is done, you can just click on the edit. And what you need to do is you need to click on connectivity, and you need to click on the private IP, and you need to define the network and the project with which you want to connect it with. So for example, I want to connect it with the current project, that is service project 1, and I want to use myFest VPC. So this particular project has 2 VPCs. I want to connect it to myFest VPC. So that is the configuration that you will make in your SQL. The second thing you do is you create a serverless VPC access. I had mentioned this in the previous video, so it's straightforward. You just need to mention an IP range and the network with which you want to connect it and the region. So it's basically the same network as the one which I showed you in the cloud SQL. So once this connector is created, this gives you the capacity to connect your cloud function to this particular network, provided that your cloud function exists within US East 1. So what I'll do is I'll go to my cloud function. I've already created a function called function5. So if you look at this particular function, the VPC connector that I have connected to is basically the same one here. So it's called connector, and it's basically the same connector here. And the other thing I will show you is basically the code. So it's just connecting to this particular IP address. This is the private IP address of the SQL instance. So this is basically the same SQL IP address, and this is the port, the root, and the password. So that's the only thing you need to change. You just need to change the host, and this is basically the private IP address of the SQL instance, and that's the only thing you need to do. You can just click on test the function to see whether it's working, and you can see that it's returning a few variables from the table. So basically I'm trying to do a select star from user, and this is the response that it gives. So this is a simple lecture. Hope this was useful, and if you have any issues, please don't hesitate to connect below. Thank you.